Good evening from Charlotte, North Carolina. No serious debate within the administration about the imminence of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. No significant discussion of not going to war. No sincere attempt to share the intelligence, or lack thereof, with the American people. And the only reason we know this now, 4.5 years later, 4.5 years too late, is because two public officials, former CIA Director George Tenet and current Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, finally have decided to start leveling with the American people. Our fifth story on the countdown: where were you when we needed you? Why does Mr. Tenet feel he can begin telling the truth now? Perhaps the reported $4 million advance he received for his new book had something to do with this. According to a copy of that new book obtained by the New York Times by, of course, walking into a bookstore and buying it, Mr. Tenet saying, quote, "There was never a serious debate that I know of within the administration about the imminence of the Iraqi threat." Nor, the former director of the CIA adding, was there ever a significant discussion about the possibility of containing Iraq without an invasion. Mr. Tenet complaining in the book and in a 60 Minutes interview to air on CBS Sunday that the administration twisted and misused his slam dunk comment about the evidence of WMD in Iraq, first to justify the invasion, then later to deflect blame onto Tenet and the CIA when no weapons were found. That didn't stop him, however, from accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush, even though he says in his book he was not at all sure he wanted to accept it. Guess he forced himself. This morning on the Today Show, White House Counselor Dan Bartlett was the designated hatchet man sent out to discredit yet another former administration official with a dangerous book.
I am a bit confused by that because the president has, and we have never indicated that the president made the sole decision based on that slam dunk comment. As you recall, when that meeting was reported, the Congress had already authorized the use of force. The president used the National Intelligence Estimate. There was a whole body of evidence and behavior by Saddam Hussein that led President Bush to believe that he had to be removed with force.
But that is exactly what the administration has indicated. Vice President Cheney twice referring to Mr. Tenet's slam dunk comment as the basis for the administration's decision to go to war during an appearance on NBC's Meet the Press just last September. The Times saying that Mr. Tenet describes having watched that episode of Meet the Press with sarcasm. When it comes to who else knew the American public was being lied to about Iraq, one Democratic senator now says you can add the entire Intelligence Committee to the list. Dick Durbin of Illinois making the amazing claim on the floor of the Senate that while he and perhaps the 16 other members of that Intelligence Committee knew the administration was misleading the American public, he, perhaps they, kept quiet about it because due to his position on the committee, he had been sworn to secrecy.
A few hundred feet away from here, in a closed room, carefully guarded, the Intelligence Committee was meeting on a daily basis for top-secret briefings about the information we were receiving, and the information we had in the Intelligence Committee was not the same information being given to the American people. I couldn't believe it. Members of this administration were in active, heated debate over whether aluminum tubes really meant that the Iraqis were developing nuclear weapons. Some within the administration saying, of course not. It's not the same kind of aluminum tube. At the same time that members of the administration were telling the American people to be fearful of mushroom-shaped clouds. I was angry about it. Frankly, I couldn't do much about it. Because you see, in the Intelligence Committee, we're sworn to secrecy. We can't walk outside the door and say, the statement made yesterday by the White House is in direct contradiction to classified information that's being given to this Congress. We can't do that. We couldn't make those statements. And so in my frustration, I sat here on the floor of the Senate and listened to this heated debate about invading Iraq, thinking the American people are being misled. They are not being told the truth. And that's why I joined 22 of my colleagues in voting no. I didn't feel at the time that the American people knew the real facts. So what happened? We invaded, turned loose, hundreds, if not thousands, of people scouring Iraq for these weapons of mass destruction. Never found one of them. Looked for nuclear weapons. No evidence whatsoever.
Larry Johnson joins us now, the former CIA officer who was a deputy director of the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism under the first President Bush. Larry, thanks again for some of your time tonight.
Hi, Keith.
Might damage to his reputation be something that Mr. Tenet should be least worried about? I mean, I understand you and some former colleagues have written him a letter about that.
It is outrageous that he has this buyer's remorse after he's accepting $50,000 speaking engagements. He's got a $4 million advance reportedly, and yet he has worried about his reputation. He should be more concerned about the deaths of 3,300 plus American soldiers who are in Iraq because they didn't need to be. He should be more concerned and heartbroken about the deaths of 100,000 plus Iraqis that have been killed because of this misadventure. This is inexcusable for him at this point, knowing what he knew, to now, I guess he's sort of like the accountant to Al Capone. The accountant to Al Capone made his money laundering possible. George Tenet enabled George Bush.
To Senator Durbin, obviously it's to his credit that he voted against that bill to authorize the action in Iraq, but what, if anything, prevented him, and legally, what prevented Mr. Tenet from telling the truth about Iraq before the war? Doing so was at best unpopular, at worst illegal, but at a minimum, obviously, absolutely essential. What did they think was keeping them from doing this?
Carelessness. You are absolutely correct to put blame as well on the Democrats. All they had to do was to go in and read the National Intelligence Estimate to realize that there was division and lack of consensus within the intelligence community. They didn't do that. And there were too many Democrats at the time that chose to sit back and to be silent on this. So this is just not blame the Republicans. The Republicans would not have been able to do this if the Democrats would have acted with an ounce of courage and spine. And unfortunately, they didn't. Most of them did not.
You wonder if you could foresee the future or even anticipate it, if you would be willing to risk being charged with violating your sworn oath to keep something secret that is false, if you knew you could prevent the deaths of 3,000 Americans and more, and the destruction of a country and all the rest of that. One would hope people would say, I'd rather go to jail than see that happen. But a technical question here. In this book, it seems, and the snark element that's been revealed from Mr. Tenet's book, it seems that he's focused on the vice president rather than the man in charge. Do you know why that is?
He doesn't want to bite the hand that feeds him. I mean, he recognizes that the Bush family is more important and more powerful than Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney's very unpopular. His unpopularity is far worse than George Bush's. So I think at this point, he's still trying to play politics. I mean, George Tenet, at bottom line, is a political animal who's playing politics still with this, trying to get off with a mea culpa, when he was, in fact, as much of an architect of this disaster as any other member of the Bush administration. Think about it. If George Tenet and Colin Powell had come out and spoken their doubts back at that time, we would not have invaded Iraq.
Yeah. If Colin Powell had resigned as the Secretary of Defense Secretary of State at that point, the world would be a different place today. But on this one phrase, this slam dunk phrase that was so essential, this new explanation from Mr. Tenet, could that not be read as morally, ethically worse than the interpretation he says is wrong? I mean, specifically he says the president asked the CIA to improve a public presentation for justifying the war, and doing that, Tenet says, would be the slam dunk. If he thought the war had not been properly debated internally or vetted or was not realistic, what on earth was he doing telling the president that he could sell the war to Americans?
If Americans go out and buy the book of this man who has admitted that what he was willing to sign on board to lie to the American people, to manipulate them, this is the same man who sat in a meeting in the summer of 2002 with the head of British intelligence and told him, we're going to fix the facts around the intelligence. He knew in the fall of 2002 that there was no relationship between bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, and yet he went and testified to that fact before Congress in February of 2003. He should not be allowed to get away with this, and what we're calling for as former intelligence officers, he should give back the Medal of Freedom, and he should at least give a portion of the royalties from his book to the soldiers and the families of soldiers who've been killed or wounded in Iraq, because were it not for his inaction and cowardice, those soldiers would still be alive and America would not be embroiled in this war.
Amen. Surprising the Medal of Freedom did not leap from around his neck when it was placed there. Former CIA officer Larry Johnson. As always, Larry, great thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Keith.
4.5 years later, President Bush